Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Transnational Feminism, Solidarity, and Social Justice lecture series. It is our second edition and the first lecture in the spring semester 2022. So thank you for joining us. It is my great pleasure to welcome to our virtual webinar today's speaker, Professor Poulami Roychowdhury from McGill University. And before we move on to the lecture, just a few words of introduction and some technical notes. Transnational Feminism, Solidarity, and Social Justice. It's a long title, and it's a new project funded by the Open Society University Network. And this is a project that brings together faculty and students from various awesome universities and colleges across the world. We have many of them among our attendees today, so thanks for joining us. And as part of this project, we are developing network collaborative courses, research and art projects, and other activities that acknowledge the importance of transnational feminism as a toolkit for social justice. So it's work in progress, and we just started a few months ago, and our lecture series are part of this larger project. My name is Agata Lisiak. I'm the project leader and associate professor of migration studies at Bard College Berlin, and I'm joining you from Berlin today. So please note that this lecture's format is a Zoom webinar, meaning that only the speakers and moderators can turn on their cameras during the lecture, but after the talk, which will last about 30 minutes, we will have some time for questions, for discussion with the audience, and then if you wish, we can make you visible to everyone by switching your camera on. You can also type your questions in the Q&A box during and after the talk. Okay, so much for technical notes. I would now like to pass on the mic to my awesome colleague, Professor Alison McKim, who will first introduce Professor Roychowdhury and later moderate the discussion. Alison McKim is an associate professor of sociology at Bard College in Annandale, New York, where she teaches courses on gender, sexuality, punishment, prisons and policing, deviance and crime, drugs and society, and more. Alison's research examines the role of gender in the contemporary US criminal justice system, social policy and law. And her most recent book is titled Addicted to Rehab, Race, Gender and Drugs in the Era of Mass Incarceration. Thank you, Alison, for co-hosting today's event.
Thank you for having me, and I'm excited to introduce Poulami Roychowdhury to all of you. She will be giving a talk on her absolutely amazing new book. But first, a little bit of background. She's an assistant professor of sociology at McGill University and researches how states regulate gendered violence and why certain instances of violence spur mobilization. This new book is called Capable Women in Capable States, Negotiating Violence and Rights in India. It's published with Oxford University Press last year in 2021. And it also recently won the Mira Komarovsky Book Award from the Eastern Sociological Societies in the United States. So that's a really notable and wonderful award to win. I'm going to be brief in the interest of time, but she has published in numerous venues, hitting some highlights of gender studies and sociology and law and society research. And I look forward to hearing more about her research today. Welcome, Poulami.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. And I know that there's people from all over the world potentially listening to this. So I hope wherever you are safe. The last few days have been very stressful for many people. And I hope you and your loved ones are okay and things get peaceful soon. Also, as you'll see, I really look forward to hearing your comments because it is an international crowd. I'll tell you why in a minute. But just to back up a little and tell you about when I started this research, I was muddling through a paradoxical situation in India, which is that, Indian legislators are really great about passing new laws, right? So there's tons of laws protecting women from all sorts of things, from various kinds of gender-based violence, to the point where Martha Nussbaum a few years ago was like, oh, the US can learn from India, right? So those are laws on the books, doing really well. laws in practice are a totally different thing. It's extremely difficult for women to access rights against gender-based violence, especially against domestic violence. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today, domestic violence. So, cases remain pending for years, like 10 years. Conviction rates are very, very low. So I wondered, given this environment, given this promise of rights and the lack of delivery, how women actually go about making rights claims, why they come forward at all, given that it's verifiably very, very difficult to get anywhere, and what happens to them. And also, a more broadly theoretical question I had in my mind was that India, to me, provided an extreme example of a much larger global paradox, which is this exact process, right? We've made lots of gains in rights legislation, comparatively fewer gains in enforcement for women's rights against violence. So by studying India, I hope to also learn something about other parts of the world. And this is where you all come in, because you are in other parts of the world. So I'd love to hear what you have to say. Is what I'm saying, does it sound familiar in the context where you live and reside? Is it not familiar? Why not? So I won't be able to cover everything today. And because of the technical difficulties we had this morning, I'm going to provide a shortened talk. But you're free to email me later with questions. So I'm going to highlight two key findings in my book. And now I'm having technical problems. Okay, there we go. Okay, so first, central questions in the book, there's three. One is, how do women claim rights against domestic violence? How do they do it? Second question, how do law enforcement personnel respond to their claims? The final question is, what are the outcomes for women who try to claim rights? Okay. Now, what are the existing ways that people answer these questions? There's two overarching ways in which people think through these questions. Social scientists of all stripes. And this is, by the way, both in people who work on India and people who work on other contexts. So when thinking through the question of, okay, how do women claim rights and how do law enforcement personnel respond to their claims? One of the dominant ways to answer this is that, well, look, law enforcement personnel are doing the selecting. They select who gets rights. And this selection process is based largely on social bias. So are you, as the claimant, performing heteronormative, hegemonic femininity? Are you from a dominant social group, which makes us think that you are performing heteronormative, hegemonic femininity? If you are poor or a sex worker or disabled or a woman of color or an immigrant, we're less likely to think that you deserve rights and we're not going to help you. So this whole framework is based around the notion that state officials protect certain women and not others. And they protect women who they deem are good victims. We all know how this works, I think. When, if you think about recent cases involving sexual violence that are in the media, you'll pick up often things like, oh, the woman is being questioned about what she was wearing or why she was drinking when this incident happens. Those kinds of questions give validity to these theories, right? That what's happening in these cases is that actually the victim is being assessed. Are you a good victim or not? If you're not, then we are not going to help you, right? So that's the dominant way of thinking through this. Now, there's a reason why I did not think that this theorization fully captured what happens in a context like India. And this is why I did not find this to be a complete understanding of what's happening on the ground. So one is, in a place like India, you're dealing with a post-colonial state, which means a couple of things. One is that the state actually has limited capacities to do everything from enforcing tax policy, but also enforcing the law. And what this means on the ground for law enforcement personnel is that they are not invulnerable to citizens. We see evidence of this in India routinely when large mobs of people get together, stone police, set their vehicles on fire, etc. We are starting to see this in places like the US too, what happened in Minneapolis, right? So that capacity constraints within the criminal justice system sometimes alter to what degree law enforcement personnel might be able to select who is a good victim. So that was one of my, initial, like made me pause, like, is this how things work? And the second, related issue is what Partho Chatterjee has theorized as political society, which is that in places like India, where people are actually quite accustomed to not being able to follow legal procedure to get rights, they have grown accustomed to doing things in a different way, which is that they routinely approach organized actors to help them access rights, and they frequently use illegal means to access legal rights. So this confluence of factors, the fact that this is a post-colonial state with limited capacities, limited sovereignty, coupled with the fact that citizens here are highly mobilized and they are accustomed to using other kinds of organizational means, made me wonder, hey, is the theory of state protection and victimhood really what happens in a context like India, or is it something else? So I'm going to go through this section very fast because I want to share my findings with you and we have limited time. The key things you need to know about this context is that approximately 31% of women between the ages of 15 to 49 say they have experienced domestic violence at some point in their life. Domestic violence includes physical, sexual, emotional, and financial violence. And 31% is actually relatively similar to places like Canada, where I'm sitting right now, and the US. So it's not like the rates are not that much higher than other parts of the world. Now, India has 3 key laws against domestic violence. The first one is the Section 125 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. This is actually not a law against domestic violence. And if any of you know the context, it can be characterized as opposite of a law against domestic violence. It tells women that if you leave your husband, you will not get alimony. But the reason I put it up here is that a lot of women, when they are abandoned by abusive men, use this law to financially survive. The 2 main laws that directly address domestic violence are the criminal law, Section 498A, which provides criminal remedies, and the civil law, which was passed in 2005, which is called PWDVA for short. Now, legal outcomes, extremely, extremely poor. And in fact, they get worse every year. And the other notable thing about domestic violence is that it literally has the lowest conviction rate of any crime prosecuted under the penal code. I will tell you potentially why in just a second. It's actually much harder to get rights against domestic violence than against rape in India. So 15.9% of tried cases led to a conviction. Almost 11% of these cases were illegally compromised. What compromise means is that once you file a domestic violence claim in India, you are not supposed to be allowed to withdraw it. But this routinely happens because everyone from judges to police officers encourage women to act like, oh, why do you really want to do this? Why don't you just go back to your abusive husband, right? So there's a lot of illegality around these laws and very poor enforcement. 10 years is the average time a woman waits for a sentence under criminal law. Very long wait. Okay, very few cases are registered under civil law. All right. Now, what else do you need to know about this context? While there is very poor enforcement, there is immense mobilization on the ground. So the picture you are looking at right now is a picture of a group called the Gulabi Gang, the Pink Gang. They number somewhere around 400,000 women. They were started by this woman in, if you can see her right here, she's wearing the lighter pink sari with the little flowers embroidered on it. Her name is Sambat Pal Devi. This group started in Bundelkhand in Uttar Pradesh. If any of you know India, this is an extremely poor part of India. It's also Dalit, and the women in this group are Dalits. So it was started by Dalit women for lower caste and other underprivileged women in this area. Currently 400,000 members. They train in martial arts. They do everything from confronting the police to beating up abusive men. And the main reason they started was to help women who were facing domestic violence. So this gives you an example of the kinds of organized forces on the ground that women can appeal to for help when they are in, need help. So political pressure for rights, which bears down not only on men, but also on the criminal justice system. The second thing that's important to understand about this context is the kind of institutional landscape that women deal with when they try to make a rights claim. Now, by the way, none of the pictures in my presentation are from people who were research participants. That's important for you to know because they don't necessarily want to be visible. So these are other photos I have of people I did not do research with. So what you're looking at right now is a county clerk's office in the state of Bihar. What I'd like to highlight is the paper that's behind this woman. Those are case files. So if it looks disorganized to you, you are right. And if it looks like those papers have been there for a long time, you are right. So this gives you an example of the kinds of capacity constraints these institutions are under. I'll give you some numbers just so you have those in your mind. By 2019, there were over 28.5 million pending cases in India's district courts. This is the backbone of the court system in India. India has one of the lowest police to civilian ratios in the world, with one police officer for 503 civilians. In the places where I was working in West Bengal, that ratio is significantly worse. It's 1 officer to 1,100 civilians. The UN recommends 1 to 202. So this gives you like a very quick snapshot of the kinds of capacity constraints this institution is under. But simultaneously, the officers who work in the system are extremely biased against women, verifiably so. They'll just, tell you to your face that like, well, a woman's job is to stay in the family and to put up with abuse. They do not want to help women who make claims against domestic violence. And they see women who make these claims as being bad women, bad wives, bad mothers. So an institution that's very biased, incapable, also vulnerable because it's incapable. And then on the other hand, lots of organizations who help women and pressure this very institution. Okay, so here is the research site. I'm gonna once again skip because we are running out of time. What I did in order to answer these questions about how women claim rights, what happens to them, how law enforcement personnel respond, is that I did 2 years of ethnography where I literally went with women to various institutions to see what happened. So about 26 months of fieldwork, I tracked 70 women's complaints. And the key sites were organizational settings, criminal justice institutions. This work, this ethnography was accompanied by in-depth interviews with activists, law enforcement personnel. And this gives you a little understanding of the kinds of women I was working with. So once again, 70 women, they varied greatly by social background. And this is important because if you remember the theories I started out with, one of the key predictions, right, is that it's the social background of the victim that determines how law enforcement personnel will respond to her claim. And therefore, it was important for me to work with women from various different kinds of background. And in this context, elite women are one, Hindu, they are upper class or middle class, and two, they are upper caste. Those are the three categories of eliteness. On the other side, Muslim women, lower caste women, poor women, women who live in rural areas are significantly disadvantaged in this context. And so I have a mix of these women in my sample. The other key ways in which my sample varied was women's access to organizational help. Women's organizations, political parties. The other involves criminal gangs, and they will crop up at some points potentially in my presentation, but there's literally a lot of evidence that criminals also help women, like people who are involved in extortion and racketing will also sometimes step in when women in their neighborhood need help. So as you can see, different women in my sample also use different kinds of organizations to access legal help. Okay, now, what did I find? So, first, the question of how do women claim rights? Well, what I noticed was there were two ways that women went about trying to claim rights. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Something just happened. Can you folks still see? Hello?
Yes, yes, we can see.
Good, is that better? Oh, I think my slide got deleted. Okay, just a second.
Poulami, we can see okay. If you want to.
Yeah, well, my slide did just get deleted. So let me see if I can fix that. Oh, good. Okay, there we go. All right, so the question of how do women claim rights? Two ways that they seem to be doing it. One is they're actually, trying to perform victimhood, just like existing theories predict. The way they do this is they, they go to the cops and say, really pretend or enact like a lack of agency, innocence. I'm a good wife. I've been cooking for him for years. He's beaten me for years. All sorts of ways in which you say that I'm a good victim. Please help me. Display their social privilege through the way they dress, etc. Right. The other thing women do is they mobilize these organized actors to help them do two things, which has nothing to do with victimhood. It has to do with pressure. So one, they deploy collective threats. And what I mean by threats is they do everything from, getting politicians who represent their areas to call the police or the protection officer to threaten their jobs if they don't help. They get organizations, including organizations like the Gulabi Gang. But in my field site, there were huge women's organizations with 19,000, 20,000 members. They would approach these organizations, they would approach political parties to do things like surround police stations until the police, helped them in some way. Second, they brokered compromises through these groups. What did a compromise look like? So you see again here, Sambat Baby, the leader of the Gulabi Gang, brokering a compromise with this cop. And usually these compromises, what they looked like were, oh, hey, here's the survivor I'm representing. She won't file an actual lawsuit if you send one of your cops to accompany us so she can just go grab her stuff from her husband's house and grab her child. So there will be no actual legal complaint, but we will have this parallel illegal process that mirrors the law that you will help us with. That's what I mean by compromise. So they were doing both of these things. What did law enforcement personnel do when women did these things? Well, what's interesting was that they really did not respond to victimhood. which is what we expect them to respond to, and what they themselves said that they liked. This is what was interesting. So in my interviews, they were like, oh, like, I really liked that woman, but I couldn't help her. And then often they were helping women who they were like, I really hate this woman. I think she's terrible and evil and has been abusing her husband, but I'm compelled to help her because of these X, Y, and Z constraints I'm under, because she is supported by the local political party and I'm afraid of them, etc. Or this thug is helping her and I don't have enough manpower here to, like withstand that criminal gang, right? So the response from the police, even though they were extremely biased, the response actually hinged on the woman's organizational connections, the degree to which her organized supporters and her could threaten them, and the degree to which they could do their work for them. And what I mean by this is, oh yeah, like sure, you can file a legal claim as long as you yourself go and collect the evidence. So get your organized group to do this and I will help you register the claim, because I don't actually want to do the work myself and I don't have time to do it myself because I'm so overburdened, right? So the response from law enforcement personnel is something that I call incorporation. It's not protection. They're not protecting women they like. They are incorporating organized women, some of whom they really don't like. And what incorporation includes is providing limited assistance, reassigning casework to survivors themselves, and promoting these parallel claims that I just told you about, where no legal case is registered, but there's an illegal process that happens that mirrors the law. So as you can guess, the sum total of these processes is a drive towards extra legality and illegality. Very few women who are making rights claims are actually getting anything from the law. But the process of making a rights claims does enable them to acquire all sorts of extremely important extra legal resources. So if you look at the top set of numbers, what you'll see is that, very few women, 78% of my sample, their cases remained pending at the end of my research. Only 20% of these women received any kind of rights through the law. And what's depressing is that a large percentage of that 25% is not receiving rights through domestic violence law. So 5 of these women are receiving maintenance through a law that is actually verifiably against domestic violence survivors, which tells them that you should not leave your abusive husband if you want alimony later on in life. So not very many rights through the law, but 27% of these women were able to use an organization to stop the violence they were experiencing, at least temporarily. 31% acquired a financial settlement, once again, an illegal settlement where they get some kind of lump sum money, but this is very important, especially for women who are poor. Et cetera, right? And by the way, these numbers do not add up to 100 because women were getting multiple things at the same time, right? So the same woman might have gotten a financial settlement and regained custody of her child. So huge drive towards extra legality, very low income outcomes through the actual law. The other thing that I saw happening was the formation of what I term women's capability. Capability is in quotes for an important reason. What did capability look like? So the very process of trying to acquire rights forced women who were maybe otherwise did not know much about the state, did not know about the organizations in the area that they lived in, and for sure had never collected evidence for their own cases, right? It force them to become capable in new ways. And this capability, involves everything from learning how to get to the courtroom by yourself, which is 2 hours away, learning how to talk to people in a police station, being introduced to an NGO where there's a job training program, which you get involved in, and then getting a job yourself, right? So these forms of capability, and this woman, Rupa, who I knew really epitomized this process, where she herself had been a survivor, but through the process of making her own legal claim, she became a caseworker who helped other women. That became her job. She built herself a house, supported herself and her son. But the other side of this capability, and this is why it's in quotes, is that it was really risky and dangerous at certain times. So in the process of doing what the police and protection officers are themselves supposed to be doing, women were sometimes beaten up by the abusive men who now they were forced to confront in order to access rights. Rupa herself became really ill from the kinds of work she did, because she was on her feet all the time, helping other women, sitting in courts for like hours in 120-degree weather. So this capability was simultaneously empowering, but also really dangerous, because fundamentally what law enforcement personnel were asking women to do was to go out and acquire rights themselves, women who were already vulnerable, and asking them to do their job for them, a job that's dangerous and which they didn't want to do because it's burdensome and dangerous. So, I will leave you with the two key concepts in my book, which is that what I saw in India is that state protection does not tell us much about what goes on in the ground. Rather, the way that we need to understand governance in this context, how the state governs violence against women, is through this notion of incorporation, where certain women, if they are capable of doing the work of the state, if they are capable of threatening the state, they get incorporated into regulatory functions where they are told to do the work of the state themselves. And this governance model leads to a very different pathway to citizenship for women than victimhood. The good victim doesn't get anywhere. Rather, it's this capable woman who gets places. And this capability does hold real potential for empowerment, but is also extremely dangerous for women. So the final thing I want to conclude with, and this is where I would love to hear all of your opinions and your reactions, is, what are the broader theoretical implications of this project? Well, first is what you have already surmised, which is that I think we need to think about protection and victimhood as localized phenomenon, and potentially more relevant to post-welfare contexts than to post-colonial contexts. Then second, the processes that I'm trying to develop, these other concepts of incorporation and capability, also, I do not think are generalized phenomenon all over the world. They themselves also have particular political and institutional foundations. And I would say that we are likely to find incorporation and women's capability in particular kinds of places, places that are like India. And what I mean by that is, what is India? Okay, one, there's a lot of political activity. Citizens are actually quite organized there. Two, there's a particular kind of state. And if we go back to Michael Mann's theorization of infrastructural power, right? The Indian state is has limited capacities, both in terms of its despotic functions and also in terms of its ability to implement policies, right? So not all states are like this. Some contenders, I would say, are Brazil, similar kind of state, potentially South Africa. What states are not like this? The US, not like this. China is not like this. A very, very high, China and Russia are both very high in terms of despotic power, right? So like the police are able to quell protests very effectively in ways that the Indian police are not. So we are unlikely to find incorporation and capability in those places. So I will stop there and turn it over to Allison and to the questions you may have. Thank you so much.